practicing social scientist at IMLS and is also the first brave soul on our virtual conference to use his webcam. So kudos to Matt for that. We want you to know that the slides, which we posted on our website and sent out the link to the agenda where you could get slides. We didn't have Matt's slides in the very initial notification we sent you, but they are there now. So if you would like to grab a copy of his slides, we have them up on our website. And once we get Matt back with his video, and I think we'll still be able to hear his voice, but we are going to enter the brave land of webcams today. So with that, I will turn it over to Matt.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Terry. And I got my camera working again. It is great to talk to everyone. I'm always thankful to Terry and her team for allowing us to be part of your community. And I've been really proud to be part of this community for 10 years. 10 years ago, almost to this day, we were meeting in Baltimore and we were talking about, gee, it would be somehow better for us to be able to compare a reading, say a summer reading project in Michigan to one in Mississippi. And that was the stories that we told. And from that, we went into a whole planning process of creating what today is the SPR. So today, the apples and oranges that I'd like to talk about involve digital literacy and broadband projects. A little bit about the overview for today. I'm going to give a little bit of snippets about how we did the analysis of the digital literacy and broadband projects, and then I'm going to present the findings. I'll do it first for those projects related to digital literacy, and I'll do it second afterwards for emerging impressions. It looks like my brave new world of seeing my cam has been replaced with a photo. So I hope that is okay with everybody. A little bit about the analytical protocols. So there were about almost 1,400 projects this year that were funded across all the SLAAs. We wanted to try to figure out, well, which of those relate to digital literacy and broadband. And we did those, that was the first piece that we did, is we tried to identify what those projects were. From those, we did some statistical analysis to describe what they look like. And in doing so, we started to bin some of the projects that were closer to each other together. And then once we had them in their buckets, we then tried to assess each of them, particularly looking for successes based on either their innovativeness, their adaptability, or their promising practices. For those that we found that seemed to be very successful, we tried to give some illustrations of some of those projects, what they would look like. Okay, so when we did the initial looking at the 1,400 projects that were funded in 2018, which of those might be related to broadband digital literacy, we identified 84 of them. 70 were digital literacy, 15 were broadband. You might do the math initially and go, hey, 70 plus 15 equals 85. That's correct. We had one project that we had identified as both digital literacy and broadband. How did we identify these projects? 3 ways. Every project, as you all know, you have a couple of subject fields that you can tag it to. The second, you have your own choice to add some additional tags to those. And then third, the program officers were giving us their assessments as well. So from those, we ended up with a list of about 84 projects. Once we got those 84 projects, we started binning them, putting them into the buckets. The first bin was to separate the 70 that were digital literacy and the 15 that were broadband. The next twist was to look at their focal area to see what they were principally intending to do. And the third one was looking at the narrative data, trying to identify what their emphasis was. This could be something about the audience, the beneficiary. It could be something specific about the types of product or activity that they were delivering. In looking at the narrative data, we're principally looking at 7 fields, and specifically really 5 fields: the title, the abstract, and then some information that people wrote about some of the outcomes that the project was doing, its importance, and thinking about some of the important lessons learned. In trying then to look at that narrative data, trying to think about, well, gee, how do we know if it's innovative, adoptable, or a promising practice? We asked a set of questions. For innovative, we looked at, is there something noteworthy about the audience that's being reached? Is there something notable about the type of project activity that the project was involved with? For adaptability, is there any evidence that we can find of replicability? Is there any evidence that's being scaled up? Is there any evidence at all about this influencing the future direction of this investment? For promising practices, we asked 2 questions. One, we asked, well, what lessons would others really want to know about this project? And second, we looked at the partnerships and trying to assess how strategic they might be. Okay, so let's now move to the findings, and the first spin will be digital literacy. So let's look at the where. We've got 23 states plus Northern Marianas who invested in at least one digital literacy project. These 70 projects span 175 activities, a little over $5 million total, with the median project a little over $31,000, and about 21% of those exemplary. When we looked at the how much of these projects cost, as I just mentioned, overall, these 70 projects, they account for more than $5 million per year. If you look at the share of this was supported by LSTA funds, it's steadily increasing from over the years from 51% in 2015 up to 70% in 2018. Okay, how were these projects, how were they trying to be administered? We looked at most of these projects, about almost 2/3 of them were simply 1 or 2 activities. At the opposite extreme, we had 10% of them were involved with 5 or more activities. When we looked, if you look at the table on the right, if we look at what types of activities these were involved with, overwhelming majority, more than 8 in 10, were instruction, then about half of them were involved content. Now just a quick note, if you're getting confused, if you start doing the math using the right-hand table, you start seeing that, hey, if I add up 83% plus 54%, that adds over 100%. Why is that going on? And that's because if you look back again at the left-hand table, a table can have more than one activity. So we're just trying to look at how many of these projects did at least one of these activities involve any instruction, content, planning and evaluation, or procurement. Okay, who were these grantees? The overwhelming majority were public libraries. Next greatest share were the state library administrative agencies, and then we had a smaller share of academic libraries, school libraries, special libraries, other type of libraries, and one that involved a consortium. If you looked at with who were doing the implementation and who were the partners, and looking at the implementing sites, again, the overwhelming majority are in public libraries, a smaller share are in libraries, or in state libraries, and then you can see a smaller share of other types of libraries as well. As you look at the partners, an overwhelming share of this is still happening at the local level with local government, and then you have some other actors involved. The school district and nonprofit, we assume, are also operating principally at a local level as well. Okay. Who were being served? We look at the beneficiaries. And this one, we could see that's a relatively even mix. Most were being targeted to the general public, about 3 in 10, to the targeted public, excuse me, about 3 in 10 to the general public, and almost 3 in 10 to the library workforce. If you look at the right, for those that were targeted, this was an optional question, so not everybody answered it. But of those who targeted, trying to get a sense of who were they targeting it to, and over about half of them were targeted by age group. Well, why? Why were they doing this digital literacy? What were they trying to achieve? Overwhelming majority, 54%, was for, more than half was for lifelong learning, in contrast to just 32% for all of the projects in 2018. Also, when we think about the digital literacy projects, they were more likely to involve economic development, 10%, than for the entire portfolio, which is just 2 out of 100, 2%. I'm going to now start looking at trying to pull in these descriptions and try to get pull more into the weeds in terms of when we looked at the narrative data, what did we start seeing as we looked at these digital literacy projects? And so the first thing we're going to do is we're going to look at the focal area that involved lifelong learning. The lifelong learning involved principally general knowledge and skills. They were about 34 of the 38 projects. Another 4 of the projects involved another intent of lifelong learning. That was formal education. So of these 38 projects, they comprise about $2.4 million, about a little more than 2/3 supported with the LSTA funds. Some of the defining characteristics, in addition to 4 of these projects focused on formal education, 6 were principally had a planning focus either to expand digital inclusion or to expand the mobility of the library's technology. 18 were focused on youth, and these are principally STEAM and STREAM projects, and 7 were focused on employment, and these were either related to employment or related to the senior population of the country. So let's now start looking at some of the highlights. The first project that we'd like to highlight is a project that came out of California, the Pacific Partnership Cooperative, the cybersecurity training for teens using Minecraft. As an anecdote, I talked to my teenage stepson over the weekend about this project, and I said, hey, do these teen gamers really play Minecraft? And he said, well, it's kind of cringy. But yeah, we do use them. Even the girl gamers use them. That's I learned my English vocabulary expanded with boy gamers and girl gamers. So as we look at this project, it was a really cool project. They're using this popular video game of Minecraft to teach teenagers about cybersecurity practices. In doing so, they developed toolkits and blog posts, and they started working through trying to develop some guiding practices, using the surveying of the patrons to figure out some great guiding practices. The second project I'd like to highlight comes out of Texas, the El Paso Public Library. And before I even knew that we had a superhero theme for this year, we had already pulled this project. And this project is titled Become a Digital Superhero. And this was a really neat, innovative project that the public library was working with the schools, in which they were taking a number of the teens and having them create their own video games and telling them stories about citizenship. And in doing so, they were using this in a very active, engaging way in which the students were collaborating with each other and with the instructors. The next 2 projects from the lifelong learning bucket we'd like to highlight are dealt with examples of adaptability. The first one comes from Florida, from the Putnam Public Library, the Levi Public Library, which is part of the PAL Cooperative, and this is in the rural part of the state, and they gave us a project called Bringing the 21st Century to Rural Libraries, Inspiring the Next Generation of Makers and Inventors. And as you can see, this was this project involved a makerspace. It was a technological overhaul of the STEAM initiative with 228 new pieces of equipment targeting over 200 classes, serving nearly 4,000 children. One of the interesting things about that they noticed is suddenly by doing this, they were noticing an increase in the participation of dads. In addition to the dads, they were noticing there was an increased niche of those families that were homeschooling. And as part of that assessment, they're looking about ways to better serve that community and in general, better be able to serve the families working in the homes, by including by expanding access with mobile Wi-Fi hotspots. The second project we'd like to highlight today comes from Indiana. It's from its School for the Blind and Visually Impaired, and the title of this project is Expanding ISBVI's Makerspace. And here's another Makerspace project, and it's using the Makerspace for, as traditionally done, for helping all types of folks, but also expanding it to those who are blind and visually impaired. In doing so, their curriculum particularly link these expanded Makerspaces efforts to their ECC expanded core curriculum. In doing so, particularly teaching skills that for those of us who can see, these come fairly intuitive, but for those who have some disadvantages, it's a more difficult, and they're using these skills, these Makerspace, to try to overcome that. The last project from this bucket that I'd like, the last set of projects from this bucket that I'd like to talk about, first one comes from Arizona and the Senior Tech, from its Senior Tech Academy in Glendale, Arizona. And this was a very innovative partnership between the local public library and community college, using digital literacy to target a population we might not always think about, and this is our senior population. And in doing so, they had they began to have conversations and looking at ways in which they can do the interact of this technology and social services to basically expand the retirees' abilities to go online, to connect socially, and gain access to unlimited lifelong learning. Well, one of their practices that they came up with is thinking about the ways you want to mesh the latest technology in supporting the social needs of this population. The last project from this focal area that we'd like to highlight comes from Minnesota, from the St. Cloud Public Library. It's called Breaking Down Barriers to Family Literacy. This project was one of the few that we noticed that was using the North Star Digital Literacy Assessment Tool to assess folks' digital literacy. In this case, there was a conscientious effort to target those who are more vulnerable, be they dislocated workers, multilingual adult learners, new Americans, and families in poverty. The work involved some very creative, extensive partnerships in the public, nonprofit, and private organizations with happening in libraries around conversation centers, outside of the libraries, in apartment complexes, a factory, daycare centers, and elsewhere. The work is helping them strengthen this project, but in general, strengthening their relationship with their other key partners to be able to expand their capacity for community engagement. I'm just going to stop now and see if maybe we have one comment or two questions.
We don't have any additional questions right now, Matt.
Okay, I will continue then. I've got everybody spellbound. That's what I like. So the next set of the portfolio we're going to look at are those projects where the intentionality involved expanding information access. There are 18 projects in this portfolio. It's about 21% of the portfolio, or about 10 SLAAs. Cumulatively, they represent about $2 million, and about 65% of this was supported with LSTA funds. When we look at these 18 projects, 14 involved in activities involving content, and 12 involved in instructional activity. Regardless of the type of activity that may have been coded, 10 of these focused specifically on planning, and a large share of these also had an audience focus, be they adults, blind and visually impaired individuals, college students, or youth. I'd like to highlight 3 projects at this point. First project comes for us from the state of North Carolina, and it's called the Refreshable Braille Display Statewide Project. And this was a really interesting, exciting project where they piloted the concept of a library providing refreshable Braille displays for blind or physical handicapped patrons. And by doing so, they are allowing the access of Braille in a formal digital format in a way that would not be accessible to many people who need it. The second project here comes from right here in my backyard in Washington, D.C. And this was a project called the Digital Literacy Initiative. And this was another project that used the North Star Digital Literacy Assessment to do their needs assessments. In doing so, they were able to identify 12 distinct areas of digital literacy. And from that, using design planning, they designed and built visualizations of how to best assess the patrons' digital literacy levels, and then to be able to apply that to serve their needs, the particular strong sensitivity to disadvantaged groups in this area. In terms of a promising practice, we'd like to highlight a project that came out of Indiana in Clinton County called Fun in the 50s. And this project focused on reaching out to the senior population again. They, particularly if I remember correctly, were looking at those men who may have been scouts early in their youth, and they took their photos, digitized them, and in the process created a memory for the community of this generation. Doing so, they were active partnership with the library, with community clubs, and senior centers. The next part of the portfolio were 8 projects. These span 6 states, about $455,000, almost entirely funded with LSTA dollars. And these projects were focused on institutional capacity, principally building up the library workforce or the library's physical and technological infrastructure. Of these 8 projects, 5 involved SLAs and 3 involved public libraries. All of them were involved in planning and infrastructure support. 3 had a specific training of librarians. While all of these involved digital technologies, it wasn't narrowly focused on digital literacy. Sometimes you could see the connection, sometimes you couldn't. And one project itself was focused on school library professional development. So one project we'd like to highlight from this bundle came from the state of Washington. It's K-12 project, and this is a multi-year initiative by the SLA that focuses on training support to those librarians in its state that were our teachers working in the school libraries. And this has been a multi-year grant, and when they got to the FY18 grant period, they decided this would be a great time to develop some curriculum on digital citizenship. What was very interesting was to see their attempt at diffusion, working with a few, empowering them and trying to expand it out to others. So in this case, they took a group of teacher librarians as the peers. They worked together in developing a curriculum that's linked to 6 hours of training that can now be adopted by others in their state. The last part of the digital literacy portfolio that we'd like to talk about are those 6 projects in 3 states that had a specific employment focus. These 6 projects comprised about $183,000 in the portfolio, and about 93% of this was supported with the LSTA grant. When we look at these 6 projects, even though the focal area was economic development, so it could have potentially been helping small businesses or just regional economic development, in this instance, it was all focused on the employment. Grantees, half of them were public libraries and half were another type of library. We generally saw a very strong evidence of a partnership in all these projects, be it with the SLAA and its public libraries, or with the public libraries working with their schools and institutions of higher learning. One project was interesting in that it focused principally on the prison population and expanding rehabilitation efforts. And the types of activities themselves varied from planning, equipment acquisitions, consultations, presentations, and training. The one project we'd like to highlight from this portfolio is an example of adaptability. Comes from the state of Vermont, and it's this project of digital literacy for job seekers. In this instance, the SLA purchased EBSCO's Learning Express library. In doing so, the accessibility of public libraries participating and academic libraries participating in this went up from 12 to 541 in that year. The future right now that they've got the product up and going, is to increase its usefulness. They're looking at ways to do better direct outreach to library directors to understand their needs and interests, doing more extensive and multifaceted training on how to use the product, and working to develop and distribute publicity materials. Let's stop again and see if there are any questions at all that might be surfacing with folks.
Hi, Matt. Let's see. David would like to know, who is this information shared with, i.e., is there a review or analysis shared with legislators?
So I'm trying to think about by information shared. I'm losing the context. If the information shared was about the work that we're presenting today, and I'm going to interpret that as such, and then you help me out if you want me to reinterpret it otherwise. Right now, we're sharing it with this group. We'll be sharing it with the rest of IMLS. We will probably also share it with the Library Statistics Working Group. We will certainly open conversations with those of our colleagues who work on the Hill, as well as any of you who work on the Hill. Maybe the best thing would be to talk to Terry and me about that, and we can keep the conversation going.
Yeah, David says you're right on target. It's the analysis of
great.
this data. Mm-hmm.
Right, so you're the first audience that we're presenting it, and this is the second year we've done this. Last year was early literacy, and we're all open for ways to make this most useful.
Okay, and there are no additional questions at this time.
Okay. So I'm going to then move to the broadband projects. And these comprised, there were 15 of these. And there are 14 states, span 14 states, 30 activities, about $3 million, nearly $118,000 median projects, so more expensive than the digital literacy projects, and about 7% of the grantees had self-identified these projects as exemplary. When we look at the how are these projects being done, the table on the left shows that a little more than 8 in 10 were simply 1 or 2 activities. On the right, when we look at what types of activities, these were predominantly instruction. When we look at the instruction, these principally involved consultations, not necessarily programs or presentations. When we looked at the how much, we can see that these projects are steadily growing over the 4 years, from $2.2 million up to $3.2 million, about a 46% increase. By contrast, these projects are less dependent on LFTA funds, with the share of LFTA funding declining from 53% in 2015 to 41% in 2018. We look at who the grantees were. These were almost inevitably SLAAs. And we looked at with whom, where were the partnering going on, even though these were principally grantees or the SLAs were the grantees. Public libraries were disproportionately the place where these projects were being implemented, 67% compared to just 3 and 10, 30% for SLAs, and a much smaller sprinkling of other types of libraries. If we looked at what type of partners, again, these tend to have a dominant local focus, with 40% by local government, 27% by state government, 20% with a nonprofit, and 20% with federal government. If we looked at who the beneficiaries were, 51% were the general population, 43% were the library workforce, and only 6% had a targeted population. If we looked at why were these projects happening, not surprisingly, over 9 out of 10 of these broadband projects involved intentionalities to improve the library's institutional capacity, compared to just 32% for the entire portfolio in 2018. So if we look at these 15 projects that span the 14 states, we tried to develop some defining characteristics about these. We note again that they totaled nearly $3.2 million, with 41% funded through LSTA grant money. Of the 14 of these 15 projects that focused on library institutional capacity, 9 specifically involved efforts around E-rate. Another 6 involved training, consultation, or assessment in improving the public library's IT infrastructure. And 3 of the 15 projects explicitly had evidence of it making an effort to improve digital inclusion. An example of innovation comes from the state of Arizona, and it was its digital inclusion project that was targeting rural tribal libraries. They particularly had 12 of them, where they were starting or maintaining Wi-Fi hotspot lending programs. These equated to 262 hotspots in total, being used almost 2,446 times during the grant period. There was an interesting use of the surveying to assess what the patrons were perceiving after they returned the hotspots. And you can see that 79% of these patrons lived in a household that did not pay for internet service. 70% were using this hotspot for several hours a day, and almost all of them plan to use that hotspot again. The second project that we'd like to highlight comes from the state of Oklahoma, and this is its EDGE project. And there were several grants of using EDGE. In this case, we wanted to highlight that from Oklahoma. And in this case, the EDGE, the SLA was providing its public libraries with access to the toolkit for being able to assess their digital inclusion needs, and being able to target, and based on that assessment, be able to target grants to those libraries to offset those identified needs. Many of these were serving rural areas where information technology is a challenge. Many of these public libraries had little experience as grantees. So in response, the SLA EDGE consultant was helping the libraries use the EDGE toolkit, creating instruction classes and documents to help them better meet the EDGE benchmarks, and coordinating the state's EDGE technology grant program. Many of the libraries reported that EDGE helped them create better services, but a large number of them didn't use the EDGE or didn't use it fully because they didn't have enough time or staffing. In response, the SLA in Oklahoma, in thinking of its future steps, it wants to work more to provide better grant writing resources to these public libraries, and in these grant applications, to make sure that there's more planning going on around the infrastructure needs and what it all entails. As an example of a promising practice comes from the state of Georgia, and its IT broadband upgrade and ongoing support project. And here the SLA has a 3-person team working around E-rates in all of the state's library systems, 62 library systems with 35 different internet service providers. The work involved anything from filling out the RFP, performing vendor assessments, identifying and negotiating the local broadband vendors, and providing general technical support. We've seen this in other SLAs as well who are involved with E-rates. I just want to highlight now that we saw strong evidence of the SLA being able to provide a centralized resource for network management, allowing the local libraries to congregate together and consort together to be able to leverage positive outputs from the vendors and to be able to consolidate the billing data. The SLA is doing ongoing assessment and involving its business model to be able to secure the highest possible speeds for its public libraries. Let me stop again and see if we have any questions.
Hi, Matt. There is a question from Claudia. She says that this is a fairly targeted question. How did the SLAAs handle the licensing component for the hotspots? Would it be only good for 2 years, and who pays afterward? I recognize that we may not have that answer, but perhaps someone in the audience, Arizona maybe, could write in the Q&A and address that, Matt, if you don't have any additional information.
No, I don't, but I would say that might be something. This is a great use of this type of study. This might be something where we might want to think about expanding a conversation a little bit further to get more of that information.
Okay, and as soon as the response comes in through the Q&A, I will let you know.
Okay. So I'm moving now towards the end of this initial presentation. I want to share some of the findings and impressions. First part is I want to contextualize this portfolio. These 87 projects, they comprise about only 6% of the entire portfolio. And if you look at it in dollar value, it's less than 2% for those 70 digital literacy projects, and the 2% of the excuse me, I am mixing up my slides, mixing up my table. So I see. Okay, my apologies. The left-hand column bars, they basically tell us that the digital literacy projects comprise a little more than 1% of all project dollars used in 2018. And the broadband about that much. If you just look at LSTA grant money, the digital broadband is comprising about 2%, and the broadband about 1% of all LSTA grants. So it's small. So the bottom line message here is these are important projects, but we recognize these comprise a relatively small share of the portfolio. As we start thinking about further exploration with these projects and other projects using the methodology that we presented today, there are some issues that we want to explore a little bit further. One is just the use of this methodology. We hope, and you can tell us if it's not true, that when we use the narrative data to supplement some of the statistics, we're bringing more life to the projects, and we can better describe the nuance of what these projects entail. Second, we're noticing a lot more evidence of a lot of the grantees in these projects doing surveying of the beneficiaries, and that's really exciting because that's helping us start to see how these projects are moving and evolving. And the third piece here on the coding, last year was the first time we introduced the coding. This is the second year, and we're getting pretty close, but we're continuing to fine-tune it. Second bullet, just want to highlight here, we're specific to digital literacy. It's really hard to get a good meaning of when does a project involve digital literacy, when does it not, and what does digital literacy mean. It's something where if we're in the elevator and we give the 30-second pitch, we think everybody will know what each other is talking about. But when you start really delving into the details, looking at the projects more closely, a lot more ambiguity surfaces. A lot of these digital literacy and broadband projects didn't necessarily involve directly digital literacy or broadband, but involved ways to expand the infrastructure to make either digital literacy or broadband more adapt, more versatile. This includes the use of Wi-Fi hotspots. It includes the use of laptops and other acquisitions of personal computing. It involves just the efforts of expanding attempts at digital inclusion across the country's communities. The next piece that we saw is that trying to get a better sense of what these projects were intending to do, we saw a number of projects that were coded that the intentionality was related to institutional capacity, but in a lot of cases it seemed that improving the library's capacity was secondary to improving some outcomes for a patron, be it their lifelong learning or their employment. And that leads to that second bullet, that a lot of the projects that were related to lifelong learning had a very strong employment content. So trying to think about the share of grants to states projects that are trying to support workforce efforts, it's much greater than just those that were labeled strictly as having their intentionality of employment support. The last bullet is to start looking at where we are in the current 5-year planning cycle and next year a 5-year evaluation cycle. I know we're going to have more information about this next year, but we wanted to just highlight a couple of points now about it. One is we'll be working a little bit more closely to try to start seeing how well all of you are mapping your state goals to the intents and within the focal areas. Second, we're trying to better track the life cycle of projects as they get repeated over multiple years, trying to get a better sense of any project that began with a planning effort. What does it look like when it's being implemented to benefit some specific audience? And the last, similarly, is to try to get a better sense of these projects that are spreading over time and space, trying to get a sense of how that spread looks like. Let's stop again and see if we have any questions.
Hi, Matt. We don't have new questions, but I think we have a bit of an answer to Claudia's earlier question about specifically how did SLAAs handle the licensing component for hotspots? Who pays? Let's see. Jamie responded that local libraries picked up the cost of the data plans after the grant cycle.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Hey, Lisa, are you on the phone?
Yeah, I am, but I think we're out of time, Matt.
Okay, so we'll just let everybody know that we have this new IMLS data product out there for folks. And it helped you, particularly with your CARES grants, and your slides have more information about this. So I see we have 1 minute left. If there are any questions, we'll take it. Otherwise, thank you everybody for your time and attention.
Matt, thank you. This is Terry, and we can, put the chat box back open if people have questions they want to chat in during the break. But we're